Hi, my name is Hilde De Smet. I'm a Belgian medical doctor, and I would like to give some of my reflections on this COVID-19 crisis. I will try to stay with the observations and not elaborate on what or who might be behind it. But I do have a lot of questions. Globally, we are moving towards a totalitarian regime. Human rights are violated in almost all of the countries of the world. Most of us are now voluntarily giving up all the rights and freedom we have fought for so long. Those who do not agree are punished in many countries with fines or even imprisonment. Violence is being used in Australia and South America, but the media doesn't show these recordings. The first quarantine camp has been set up in New Zealand for people who refuse to be tested. Some countries, like Argentina, have been in uninterrupted lockdown since March. The collateral damage is enormous. Since the beginning of this pandemic, there has been a censorship on people who speak out about this. Posts, articles from doctors, scientists and experts who have a different opinion than the official narrative are removed from most of the social media. The mainstream media is not interested in open debate. Many measures, of which science has proved that they don't work or have no scientific basis, are still imposed on the people. We are relentlessly bombarded with figures, without those figures being interpreted. Continuously we hear numbers of deaths without them being compared to, for example, flu deaths in other years or deaths to other causes. Only COVID matters. The collateral damage and all the deaths due to the measures are not important. The end seems to justify all the means. What is going on? Who can benefit from this? All this to conquer this COVID pandemic, of which a recent World Health Organization report by Professor Ioannidis has now shown that the infection mortality rate is 0.24%, which is comparable to the flu, in contrast to the 3.4% reported in March. First of all, I would like to say that I don't want to deny anything. I know that in March and April in Belgium many people have died and that many of these deaths were COVID related. I really sympathize with the families of the deceased, as well as with people who still haven't fully recovered after past COVID infection. It is a nasty virus to some of us. In some people it causes an overreaction of the immune system. Fortunately, the medical world has learned a lot in recent months, and we can cope with most of these heavy reactions, for example, by administering blood thinners. But to put things in perspective, don't forget, 98% of the population who gets corona gets no symptoms at all, or only very mild ones. At this moment, Belgium is officially in the middle of the second wave and almost in a lockdown. We are not the only ones. Many countries are. Some countries have been in an uninterrupted lockdown since March. But at this point, despite all the panic, there has not been any excess mortality in Belgium since March and April, and a little peak in August, until week 43, that is until October 25th. This means that no more people have died in comparison to the last 5 years in this period of year. Important information, isn't it? Why is this not told in the media, in the press releases by our experts to comfort the population instead of feeding the fear? Later more about this. Let's go a little back in time. In Europe it all started in February, March. The virus was spreading and we were afraid that our health system and hospitals wouldn't be able to cope with the flood of sick people. Flatten the curve, that was what we had to do, so we went into lockdown. Many people died in Belgium during that period, half of them in homes for elderly people. What was very striking during that early period was the censorship that already took place at that time. Posts on social media by doctors and scientists who had another view about this pandemic than the official story, or who dared to ask questions, were almost immediately blocked. We soon knew when a video came in with interesting news, very often from medical doctors, we had to share it as soon as possible with the message, "Please watch before it is removed." And after a few days, it was gone. I got messages from people about how to block fact-checkers on my Facebook account. I had never heard of fact-checkers before. Fact-checkers are people employed to distinguish between real news and fake news, and they flag your post as fake news when they consider it fake. Translate: fake news is all the news that does not match the official story. Fact-checkers are now the new normal. Strange, because in a crisis situation you would expect that as many scientists and experts as possible should have their say in order to arrive at the best possible solution. Science is nor black nor white, it is evolving all the time. And only through debate and listening to different opinions can one get the full picture and learn how to approach it. We soon learned how this censorship came about. The World Health Organization has issued a general appeal to fight the infodemic, fake information about the current pandemic. This appeal was accepted by the European Commission, and from then on, freedom of expression was no longer allowed, one of the fundamental human rights. Doctors, scientists, experts and citizens were not longer allowed to express their opinion unless it matched the official story. And so the scientific debate stopped, or rather, it has not yet been allowed to take place. The sad thing about this censorship is that most of the people have no idea that this is taking place. And by continuously hearing the same information, data without any reference or comparison, a tunnel thinking arises, a blind belief in what is told. More on this later. YouTube has recently acknowledged that it has removed 200,000 videos. I repeat, 200,000 videos criticizing or asking questions about the upcoming rescue bringing V. I'm not gonna say the word, so this video can hopefully circulate on classical social media for a while. Apparently, nobody is curious about what those 200,000 people on YouTube have to say. And now we are not yet talking about all the deleted posts and accounts on Facebook and Twitter. Why is this happening? Who is benefiting from this? In any case, those who want to get a different information on COVID will have to turn to other media like BitChute, Vimeo and others. I am not going to elaborate on this theme of V now. This will be for another video. Well, let's go on. In Belgium, the peak of the COVID pandemic was over in May. The measures were not so strict anymore, and many were able to partly resume their lives. However, what happened then was a very strange thing. The government and the advising team of experts seemed to have forgotten about flattening the curve. More and more asymptomatic people were tested for COVID-19 with a PCR test. The number of tests grew exponentially, and so did the number of positive people. The number of infected people increased so much that the government started talking about a second wave in mid-July, and the mouth mask obligation was introduced. At that time, the hospitals were almost empty, and there were almost no deaths. Don't get me wrong, by infected people, I don't mean sick people, no, just healthy people who tested positive. So now it obviously became crush the curve, flatten the curve. The reason why all the measures were installed seemed to be forgotten, also by the population. We just took this. What we have known since the beginning is that the PCR test is not diagnostic. This is recognized by the FDA, the Center for Disease Control, the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford, as well as by Cienzano, our own Belgian National Public Health Institute, and the Dutch RIVM. The PCR test cannot distinguish between old and new infections and does not say anything about contagiousness. In addition, the number of false positive tests of this PCR test is very high, especially when an asymptomatic population is tested. A PCR test on someone without symptoms says nothing. A PCR test on someone who is ill does not say much either, without any additional lab confirmation, and certainly not if that person is only tested for COVID, but not for other viruses. But for some mysterious reason, despite of this knowledge, the testing of asymptomatic people continued with this PCR test, the contact tracing, the quarantine, the contact tracing, the quarantine, followed by that more and more, and the numbers reported by the media became darker and more terrifying by the day. In addition to the general measures imposed by the government, each local authority was now, we're talking about the summer, also allowed to implement its own additional measures, whether substantiated or not. And so it started, if I remember correctly, with Antwerp. Suddenly, everyone who came out on the street had to wear a mouth mask. The other local authorities could not stay behind. This time we had to deal with a contagious fear. And in no time, it was almost everywhere in Belgium mandatory to wear a mouth mask, even in the open air, even when no one was around. Fear of the virus was all around. So let's talk about these mouth masks for a moment. Mouth masks don't work for healthy people. They don't do anything. A review published on the website of the Center of Disease Control on May 26th about the use of mouth masks for influenza, which studied 14 randomized clinical trials, showed no evidence. The World Health Organization set up a new study published in The Lancet on June 1st. It concluded about mouth masks: reduction in risk of infection, low certainty, with stronger associations with the N95 or similar respirators compared with the disposable surgical masks or similar reusable 12 to 16 layer cotton masks. 12 to 16 layer cotton masks. The law just states that people have to wear a piece of fabric covering mouth and nose, and that is what most people here wear, and I guess also in other countries. So the N95 mouth masks, which have stronger associations, are unfortunately poorly tolerated. They produce marked hypoxia and hypercapnia, so lack of oxygen and accumulation of CO2, and many health professionals have already exchanged them for a normal surgical mask. Another study, a Norwegian study, calculated that 200,000 people had to wear a mouth mask for 1 week to prevent one infection. This study got a lot of criticism, so the new estimate became 75,000 people had to wear a mouth mask to prevent one infection. Still a lot of people, right? Mouth masks could have a purpose in two situations. If worn by people who are sick and contagious at that moment, to decrease droplet infection, and they could be used by caregivers who care for sick people, if used correctly, which we certainly cannot say that the general population does. If we see all this evidence, why are mouth masks then mandatory? We know now that they serve to create the right behavior in people. In Belgium, and probably also in many other countries, there is an official info cell that continuously monitors the behavior of people and accordingly adjusts the measures and the reporting via the experts and the media. I have this information from a befriended lawyer. This on the advice or the demand of the World Health Organization. To teach people the correct behavior in this pandemic, to condition them, to motivate them to keep sufficient distance, to limit social contacts, sufficient fear is needed, and a continuous reminder of the danger, hence the mouth masks. And it works. I see young and old people walking in the forest with a mouth mask on. I see people riding their bikes with a mouth mask on, people wearing it under their motorcycle helmets, people wearing it sitting alone in a car. Fear reigns about common sense, that is clear. And because of this fear, we have been living with extra ridiculous measures for many months imposed by local authorities. In addition to making the use of mouth masks mandatory almost everywhere, in the open air, even with no people around. For example, local sports commissioners decided a few weeks ago that it was no longer allowed to change in the changing rooms of sport clubs. As a result, I saw 16-year-old teenagers changing in the parking lots of sport clubs, standing with their sweaty, bare chests in the cold. Last week, I received an email from the school for my sons that from now on a mouth mask had to be worn during sport lessons. Doesn't anyone have any common sense anymore? And all of this in the name of public health. Anyway, all is good as long as we don't get COVID, right? Last week I went with a colleague to the Orde van Geneesheren. In English, this is the Order of Physicians. It's the Belgian organization who gives deontological and ethical advice to medical doctors and also has the authority to withdraw someone's license to practice medicine. The theme was mouth masks. You know what their advice was? Can't you pretend? Just follow the rules, despite of the scientific literature. We were honestly shocked. The Hippocratic oath we swore for the sake of our patients' health is obviously no longer important. So we just have to follow the rules and definitely not think for ourselves as medical doctors. Sometimes I am ashamed to be one. So back to the second wave now. So since May, the numbers of tests kept increasing. The second wave was announced in July. Flatten the curve was forgotten. There were no additional hospital admissions and no deaths at that moment. And now we are at the end of October, and yes, now we are actually seeing more hospital admissions. The fear among the population and among the doctors has been fed for months, and now it is really happening. The prediction comes true. Firstly, I want to repeat this. Despite all the panic at this moment, there has been since March and April no excess mortality in Belgium, besides a small peak in August during the heat wave. The data show this until week 43. That was last Sunday or Saturday, 25th of October. About this week, we don't have the data yet. There is definitely something going on. The number of hospitalizations is increasing. We cannot deny this. But does this justify the measures, the lockdown, the overall panic, stopping the world from living? And are the numbers of hospitalizations reported to the public correct? I wonder. Yesterday, 6,497 hospital beds were taken by COVID patients, as reported by Cienzano, which I admit is a lot. But this number reported by Cienzano includes 1,600 extra COVID beds that have appeared out of the blue during the last 5 weeks, which don't correlate with the new COVID-related hospital admissions minus the discharges. You can do the calculation yourself if you go to the daily reports. Strange, how is this possible? But Cienzano refuses to publicly release the number of admissions per hospital. Why? That would definitely provide more clarity. I put this calculation on Facebook. After one day, the links to Cienzano were forbidden. Apparently, it is not desirable that people study these numbers. In 2019, 1.4 million people died of tuberculosis. Has the world economy been shut down for this? Was a generalized mouth mask obligation introduced? Were lockdowns introduced for this? The fact checkers already have their answer ready for this. They say yes, but COVID spreads much faster. Tuberculosis can be latent or active. The spread is different. All true, but the fact remains the same. More people die each year from the infectious disease tuberculosis than from COVID-19. And nobody really cares. Neither seem people to be bothered by the increased deaths from heart attacks, the cancer diagnosed at a later stage because people no longer dared or were allowed to go to the hospitals. No one seems to be concerned about the increase in suicides at the moment, and with the current economic situation, 1 on 4 Belgian companies is on the edge of bankruptcy right now. We can expect that this will not decrease in the coming years. No one seems to be bothered by the increase in domestic violence by the measures, the increased poverty which makes people more susceptible to disease and even starve in some developing countries. Most people are more afraid of COVID than of cancer right now. Nobody seems to care about the elderly, who are barely allowed to receive visitors at this moment, and many of whom in March and April have died all alone because their families were no longer allowed to visit them. The effects of psychological well-being on the immune system have now been sufficiently scientifically demonstrated to know what this deprivation of social contacts can do. But in this whole COVID narrative, we don't talk about the immune system at all. That the continuous media-induced fear, the continuous wearing of mouth masks and the continuous disinfection of the hands, the decrease in social interactions and the financial stress undermine the immune system is not so important. At the end of March, I made a video about naturally strengthening the immune system, and after 10 days it was removed from YouTube. It was clear that this information was not helpful in this crisis. Well, all this collateral damage, let's not talk about it. This is all not so important as long as we don't get COVID, right? Most of the people at this moment have what in psychology is called tunnel thinking, as the psychology professor Hilde De Smet clearly describes in his Knack article. They only see that which is constantly being put into their consciousness by the media, experts and government. COVID, alarm, fear. For the rest, they no longer have an eye. The infocell is doing a good job, I guess. So what about our Belgian politicians, our policy makers? In my opinion, most of them do have good intentions, but the only information they get is from a handful of experts, no others. They are put under pressure by the World Health Organization and infected by the decisions of other countries. Talking about contagiousness. And most of all guided by fear. We see this in the measures imposed by the federal government, but certainly in all these extra, totally useless measures that municipalities and other authorities impose. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But good intentions without a critical eye, without asking questions, without being able to think out of the box, can do a lot of damage, and this is what we are seeing now. Besides that, in Belgium, in some of the parliaments, and we have many, I don't know if it's in all of them, but only a part of the party members are allowed to join due to the COVID restrictions. And it is the chairman who decides who is allowed to participate. There goes our democracy. And finally, I would like to end. I would like to mention that unlike announced in most countries, there is currently no second wave in Sweden. This country has not enacted a lockdown and no masking obligation. They just used common sense. Due to this policy, the country has apparently achieved herd immunity. Their mortality rates contrast sharply with the mortality rates in countries with very strict measures, such as Argentina, where there has been a lockdown since March. In our country too, the strict policy has apparently not yielded much in recent months. I believe it is not correct to blame the people for this, because most of them did follow the rules. As I said in the introduction, the first quarantine camp has now been set up in New Zealand for people who refuse to be tested. This was predicted a few months ago, but even I wouldn't believe it at that time. And now they are there. For me, this rings a bell, and I, as many others, are starting to see the analogy with another very dark period in history. Dare to fear at that time for the Great Depression was the original motive. And because of this fear, many intelligent people could eventually be convinced to participate in massive crimes against humanity. Am I exaggerating? I don't know. Food for thought. Thank you for watching this video. Bye bye.